Today on the HopeFilled Financial Podcast, I'm going to talk about how I didn't have a cell phone until about halfway through my college career. Our budget tip is going to cover when it's wise to use cash to pay for your groceries. Our listener question covers the balance between feeling guilty and exercising generosity. And for our main topic, I was a guest star on the Talking About Business podcast. We're going to go over the highlights. Good morning and welcome to the HopeFilled Financial Podcast. My name is Jay Disberger, your one and only HopeFilled Financial Coach, and I'm happy that you're here with us today. And today's story that I want to share with you is truly one that I've been thinking about for a while, and I think it's a good example of exercising frugality. When I was younger, when I was growing up, my parents subscribed to the idea that you didn't want to give a child a smartphone or related device until they said that they were mature enough to deal with it. They didn't subscribe to, it's a particular age when the child is ready. It was a maturity level. Now, my brother Jordan really wanted an iPod Touch. Back in the early days with the first 2 or 3 versions of the iPhone, there was a sister device that was released. It was basically the exact same thing, but without the cellular cell phone component, like a small iPad more or less, if you don't remember them. So he really wanted one because he knew that he wasn't old enough for a phone, but it was still a fun little electronic device with a touchscreen. I was a little less enthusiastic about them. I didn't really want one, but my parents thought that I was the one who hit the maturity level for these devices the most, and they thought it would be kind of funny for my birthday to give me an iPod Touch. I think it was a second generation. This was early enough that the iPod didn't even have a camera. At least I don't think it did. As a result of me having one, Jordan very quickly saved up the money to go buy an iPod Touch of his own, and with my parents' blessing, indeed, within a few weeks, he got one. And I didn't realize how useful a almost smartphone device could be, and I naturally carried it with me everywhere. And I didn't get rid of it until I got the first iPod Touch with a front-facing and a back-facing camera. I remember that was quite the leap when Apple announced that, and I got that iPod, that second one, right before a vacation, and I took just hundreds of photos. So I had this second smartphone-like device that was not a phone all the way through until 2 to 3 years into my college career. And you might ask, well, how did you manage to go about a social life without a phone? Well, most of the friends that I had in college liked to text or use group chats or Facebook Messenger. And I could do that. I could engage with that type of communication with an iPod Touch. I just couldn't do the phone calls. Well, unless I was around Wi-Fi. There was an app, a text-free app, and I could, with a number that was assigned to my device, text anytime I was on Wi-Fi, and I could also make phone calls. The phone calls were limited, but the texts were free. And that's how I maintained communication for the front half of my college career. The one bit of utility that I didn't have without the cellular phone was naturally if my car broke down, calling for help. But I, for the most part, was around Wi-Fi. I had good Wi-Fi at my parents' house where I lived at the time, and K-State had free Wi-Fi basically everywhere on campus. So for 90% of the time that I could possibly be wanting to be in digital communication with someone, I could. And I didn't need a phone. And the question I want to ask you is, was it frugal for me to just continue using the iPod Touch instead of upgrading to an iPhone? I already had the iPod Touch device. It was a gift. A phone would have been an expense, and I would have ended up having to pay for the cellular bill, the cell phone bill. During this season of life, I was way more concerned with scraping together my pennies that I was earning working part-time in order to cover my tuition. And I didn't see a cell phone bill as a genuine need. For now, it's time for today's budget tip. Today's budget tip is to use cash for your groceries if you have a hard time keeping your grocery food budget in check. More or less, I'm saying engage with the envelope system, or as the kids call it these days, cash stuffing. Effectively, in practice, it looks like this. At the beginning of the month, after your first paycheck or right before your first trip to the grocery store, go to the bank or the ATM and pull out the money that you need for food that month and stuff it in an envelope. Now, when you go to the store to buy groceries, you only use money that comes out of that envelope and you label it food or groceries. This gives you a tangible representation of how much money you have left in your budget to spend on food. And it also engages the pain centers in your brain a lot more while you're spending. If you were to go spend $1,000 on your credit card, you probably wouldn't feel that much. However, if I put $1,000 in cold, hard cash on your dining room table and told you to go spend it, well, I think you're going to be a lot more thoughtful because it's more painful to let go of that much tangible cash. And that's why cash stuffing for grocery spending causes more friction between you and an impulse purchase. It helps you say no to non-frugal impulses while you're shopping. Grocery stores are very good at making you make impulse purchases. It's actually what we're going to be talking about next week for the main topic. So in summary, if you're struggling to keep your budget in check for food, use cash. Now, it's time to answer a question submitted by you. Today's question comes from Abby. Abby asks, I've always wrestled with guilt and feeling like I should be doing more to help those in need. I already donate a good portion of my money, but always wish I could be doing more. How do I balance the desire for radical generosity with the desire to save up for an early retirement and paying off loans early? Abby, this is a great question, and I'm going to cover things in the reverse order. Let's focus on the loans first. So if you have a loan, and I'm not talking about a mortgage, I'm talking about consumer debt loans, including credit cards. If you have that kind of debt, you're paying money in interest away to wealthy lenders. It's not going to those in more need. It's lining the pockets of those who already have enough money to lend to you for once, basically. And if you think about it that way, it's going to take some of your income right now that you don't get a say as to where it's going. You know that it's going to someone who already has a lot of money, and it puts it back into your control, and it allows you to be more generous with that money. It allows you to cover your needs, like retirement, sooner, faster, so you can engage with more radical generosity sooner. So in effect, paying off debt to take care of yourself is enabling you to be more generous. And that's a way to look at it so that you don't feel guilty for taking care of yourself financially. And the same thing goes with retirement. Think about it. When you're on an airplane, the flight attendant tells you you need to put your own oxygen mask on first before helping anyone next to you or a small child. The reason is if you don't put your mask on first and you try to help a child, before you successfully help anybody else, you and the child might very well pass out because you didn't put your own mask on first. You need to make sure that you're taking care of what is your responsibility within your boundaries for your financial future, for your financial needs, for your four walls, before you engage with radical generosity outside of that. By putting on your mask first, by making sure that you're covering your four walls, you're debt-free, your retirement is established, and at the very least, coasting to the point where you can retire with dignity, well, then you can look at that generosity beyond that and say, this is what I can freely give. It's what you can give freely without guilt and without compromising your financial future, without forgetting to put the oxygen mask on for yourself. Don't forget, money is a tool that enables you to be more of who you are. If you're a naturally generous person and you take care of your financial future, you take care of your retirement, you take care of your financial health, it's going to enable you to be more of that radically generous person that you naturally are. Abby, I hope that helps you, and I hope that helps all of you listening. Now, time to move on to today's main topic. Now, recall from the story, I talked about my brother Jordan, and I talked about my parents. My brother Jordan and my father, Russell, started a podcast together. My father is a business consultant, self-employed. He runs a consulting business called Aspen Business Group. My dad is the textbook example of a natural talent, and a successful one at that. My brother Jordan is radically ambitious, incredibly talented, like very high energy, and wildly intelligent. He not only has an electrical engineering degree, but he has an MBA. he started a marketing company called Purple Marketing Consulting, or Purple Marketing. And he helps people with their online digital lives as businesses so that they can spread the word about the value that they're providing to people. And as a part of that, Jordan started a podcast where he and my dad talk about business, thus the name Talking About Business. I was visiting my dad and I overheard them recording. Jordan talked about frugality and was sort of teasing the idea that in a future episode of their podcast, they might talk about frugality. And that would be a really interesting topic to discuss how frugality impacts business. Well, I texted Jordan and my dad and I was like, hey, I do the frugality thing on the HopeFilled Financial Podcast. It is the intentional practice of prudent economy. And it might be really interesting if you approached it from that or reviewed the definition that I had and gave me a shout out. They did me one better. They recorded the next day and asked me if I wanted to sit in as a collaborator or a special guest and discuss frugality. And so that's exactly what I did. Their invitation caught me so off guard that I didn't even have my traditional bow tie to wear on the recording, so I'm just in a normal polo. In the context of business, I think we ended up focusing, if I remember right, more about how if you run your own business, you're in charge of all of the cash flow, and you can exercise your business spending in a way that is most efficient to you, the most frugal way for you. And there's nothing stopping you from doing that other than you putting forth the intentionality and the discipline to do so. However, if you work in a larger company, say one which has a bunch of managers and a hierarchy and groups, and each one gets a chunk of the budget, well, there's this use it or lose it mentality around the more corporately structured budgets. If you don't use it, you might not have that money available in the future budget. And that somewhat more or less naturally encourages what you could interpret as frivolous or less frugal spending in order to make sure that you're still getting that chunk of the budget the next time it rolls around, just in case you need it for something productive. And indeed, in business, it's interesting to apply the concept of frugality, the concept of intentionally practicing prudent economy, and seeing how it's different for different businesses and thinking about the trade-offs for different kinds of companies. And with that, these are the highlights from my guest appearance on the Talking About Business podcast.
All right, welcome to Talking of Business with your hosts, Jordan and Russell Disberger, and today with special guest, Jay Disberger from HopeFilled Financial.
How do what you do, how does it help a business?
And the big difference between doing finance with business and finance in personal life, personal finance is that, well, it's personal. It's a very different facet of your brain when you're working on your own numbers, because personal finance is more personal than it is finance. When it comes to business, though, there are still principles that apply to both. The biggest one of which would be frugality. That is I call it the financial virtue that should be the litmus test for all financial decisions that you touch in both business and your personal life.
So I think that goes back to what you were alluding to, Jordan, of how you and I would put Jay in this category, how we absolutely hate to buy or pay retail. So why don't you explain, Jordan, what you do and what do you mean by frugal?
What I do everything. Um, no, I own a digital marketing business. I'm also a full-time engineer, podcaster, lender as of this month, homeowner, landlord. Anyway, um, being frugal is very important to me, and I think that's a value that you instilled in us, Dad. And as I've gotten older, I think I've I think I think of all of us, I probably go the furthest in terms of looking for the cheapest possible deal for the highest quality.
I'd say Jay's really close. I mean, he drove all around northeastern Kansas to furnish his house for under $500, right?
The bulk of it was under $500. If you include the desk from my home office, I definitely blew past that.
But it was
But
still a fraction of the
it was
price
like
of the retail.
$200 a
Yeah.
room on average throughout the house.
And
We ended up with two loves. The cheapest love seat I got was $2.
Yeah. So I mean, so I think, Jordan, you live on auction sites and buying new, and if it
Yeah,
doesn't
yeah.
work, you
What
turn
you
around
just
and sell it.
described is Saturday for me.
Well, and so the idea is that there's some individuals that, and thank goodness for them, that like to go out and buy retail and pay full price at any store. And most businesses don't have the luxury to have all their employees, look for the cheapest price, because time is money. And so the time that a business owner or an employee is seeking out or trying to find the location, um, it can be very, very difficult to justify the time
Well,
compared to the
you're talking
savings.
about getting your time past the point of diminishing returns.
That's right.
So at what point does the amount of time you're investing into trying to find something cheaper become more of a cost to you than the difference from what the next best thing is that you've already found? And when I define frugality, Jordan, how do you define frugality
And then,
for starters?
and then Jay will.
Yeah, then
So
I will.
frugality, I would define as kind of what we had said before, looking for something that isn't necessarily full retail price, but you're also looking for quality. You're holding on to your cash and wanting to stretch it as far as you possibly can.
When you're talking about stretching it with something quality, you're talking about investigating the
The
life
life
cycle
expectancy.
cost, the whole life cost analysis for a given purchase. Like if you got something cheap and you had to rebuy it every year versus buying something that would last 10 years.
My favorite analogy, someone asked if you spent like $200, $300 for a pair of shoes, and the individual said, "Is it worth it?" He says, "I don't know. I haven't worn them out yet." So the question is not the initial price, but it's the long term value and the return on the investment.
Well, and for the shoe example, it can be different. What's frugal for one person might be different for another. If you're really hard on shoes and you do the kind of work that tears shoes up, you don't want to buy expensive shoes if you're going to go out and end up scuffing them up and then cutting through them because you work in a shop or you work with a lot of things that are going to tear them up, and you're going to end up destroying the shoes before you wear them out. In that case, it would be probably cheaper to buy an inexpensive shoe if you're going to buy it just as often by the nature of the work and what you're using the shoe for.
Jordan, as it relates to, you're working for a larger company right now, and you've also consulted with a number of companies. How frugal would you say most of them
Well,
are?
the engineering company that I work for, I have personally wasted hundreds of thousands of dollars that have turned into nothing. Um,
But when you say wasted, it wasn't intentional. It just didn't work out.
it wasn't not intentional. It was, we're buying this because someday we may need it.
Because it was it in your budget, and so you did it.
Yeah, so we're told, hey, we have this much money in our budget. If we don't spend it, we're not getting it next year. So we're encouraged to spend it.
The adage is, so your definition of frugal, you see it as wasted because you didn't need it yet and you were told to spend it. The old adage, when I've worked with universities, colleges, governments, or even most businesses, if I'm giving you a budget, you use it or lose it. Because a lot of times what companies do, or nonprofits or governments, is they take what they spent last year and add an inflationary rate to it. Sometimes they'll even take a look at their growth cycle and just again add to what they did the previous year.
I think uh, from from the perspective of a big business to a small business has the opportunity to try to stretch the dollars that they have and maybe some of the partnerships or um, tools that they're already using. They could optimize them or improve uh, the way that they're operating and try to streamline those operations and optimize the different tools they're utilizing.
So, Jay, as it relates to businesses, what tips would you have, or what have you seen?
In the way of running a business? Well, I just want to comment first on the what you said with the budgets being either top down or from the bottom up.
Right.
Either way, what I've heard as far as the difference between a big business and a small business, and a bigger business when you have departments and you're breaking the budget up. And in Jordan's example, where they feel like they have to spend it or they lose it because they'll lose it in future budgets, and they want to make sure they have that capacity, is it sounds like there's an exercise of political power in order to fight for the largest chunk of the budget that they can get in order to run their department.
Well, so there's this adage of limited resources, and so you're competing against other departments, which creates politics.
Right. And the political power, as I've always seen it, is the exercise of delaying the making of a decision until that decision is no longer necessary. And if you have a budget, you don't need all of it in order to try to hold on to the power that that portion of the budget gives you. You may spend that money in a way that isn't optimal for your department. Did I understand that correctly, Jordan?
Yes.
And another problem with that is everyone's opinion of what is optimal for your use of the budget is going to be different, from the managers to the people who are working within the individual departments to those who are governing from the top down, if that's the way that the budget is structured. So when you have a smaller business, you were saying you have more opportunity to stretch the dollar. I think what you have is you have a situation where you don't have the exercise of political power, and you can feel like you're the ultimate decision maker.
Well, I think they just truly have limited cash. So
Well, there's also that too.
Yeah,
So
so-
you have to be more creative in how you're using that budget in order to make your goal.
I mean, the concept of a
Achievable.
lean startup, shoestringing it, is typically seen on a small business or a project that's thrown out there because they're trying to see if it can float.
So when you're looking at the difference between small shoestring startup or a lean startup or a larger company where there are a lot more opinions involved, how do you derive the difference between a company that's being frugal with their budget or a company that's being cheap with their budget or miserly with the budget?
Well, there's Michael Porter, a Harvard professor, Dr. Michael Porter. He had developed this concept of a value chain.
Mm-hmm.
And what you try to do when developing a budget, you want to make sure that every dollar is supporting either the ability to drive profit, improve customer experience, or the employee experience. And you have to prioritize those elements. But there's so many things. It's like what Elon Musk has done with Twitter.
Mm-hmm.
90% of those employees are gone from the day that he showed, yet Twitter is still operating. To me, you have to justify what you're doing. And regardless of the size, and going back to what you said, Jay, there's a point of diminishing return, analysis paralysis. We want to make sure that we are spending the right amount of money to get the right return that we need to.
Well, and it's that point of diminishing returns that I focus on a lot in the last part of the way that I define frugality for the personal finance ministry that I have. So, and we've used all but one word, really, or all but one concept in the way that I define frugality in the conversation already. I talk about frugality as being the intentional practice of prudent economy. We've talked about being intentional and how, well, the difference between doing something intentionally or doing something spontaneously, that's a gray area. The way that I try to help people figure out, am I being intentional or not, is was it written down in advance before you went and made that action? A common example is if you go to the grocery store and you have a shopping list, or if you're going and buying something for your company and you have a list of assets you need to buy, but while you're out and you're making those purchases, you see something that you need. You've thought about it before in the past that you needed it. It's not on your list though today. Do you buy it anyway? Was that an intentional purchase or was it done on a whim?
What did we not
Divide.
cover?
So we've talked about intentionality and how it's important that you do things on purpose with an intention, with a goal, and that goes back to the chain that you were talking about.
Value chain.
And then there's practice, actually being able to make it practical, being able to make it actionable, making it something that you can do repeatedly and build a habit. We've talked about practicing the budget. The one that we didn't talk about was prudence. In the way that I define prudence, you might get some. I mean, prudence is a fairly vague word most of the time when I bring it up.
Yeah, and some people use it as a positive. Some people see it as a bad.
Right. And there was a podcast I was listening that said the difference between prudence and cowardice is a fine line when it comes to your personal behavior and your decisions. But the definition for prudence for me is going to be minimizing your exposure to undue risk. So taking in information, considering the possible outcomes that result from your decisions, and then making the decision that minimizes your exposure to undue risk. Now, if you take
And
that to an
I, I,
unhealthy extreme,
I would call that stewardship.
I mean, you could just definitely say prudence and stewardship in that regard.
Yeah,
Specifically when it comes to money and
you're
exercising
being a good
business,
steward of your
right?
money.
And prudence is more broadly applied, as it can apply to what you say in a conversation. You could say something that is prudent in order to minimize the uh, the risk for tension to develop from that conversation or animosity or something that could sever the relationship. You don't necessarily get that out of the definition from stewardship.
I guess George Bush, when you say prudent, that wouldn't be prudent. It would be prudent. And then,
No one's gonna remember
or
that.
anyhow, I thought that when Jay was saying it, that's what went through my head. And then there's Saturday Night Live spoof on George Bush.
But but as you know, from a principle of business, higher risk equals higher reward. So the discerning thing when it comes to exercising prudence in business is what is the difference between an appropriate risk and an undue risk? What kind of risk can you not afford to take on? And how do you walk that line? Well, that takes the expert within the business or the experts in order to exercise the appropriate decisions.
Which I guess I'm going to kind of summarize things is that you really do need to have people that have a kind of an owner's mindset and be a good steward
Right, not
of,
acting
of
in a
the
selfish
company.
interest.
Right, not political, as you said, for power.
Mm-hmm.
They need to make sure that if this was my money, would I spend the money here, or is there another way of doing it? It's like you spend your weekends, Jordan, buying things on auctions or your days. I like to build things, refinish things. I mean, when you have limited resources, it's amazing how you get by.
Well, and that brings up the last part, because what the most prudent decision is for you is in conflict sometimes with the last facet of frugality. So intentional practice of prudent, then economy is the last one, or the fourth part. And I define economy as being, in the personal finance practice, the exercise of maximizing your happiness per dollar spent or saved or given. So if you go and buy something that has all the bells and whistles on it, everything that you absolutely want, you're probably spending a lot more than if you bought something that got most of what you wanted, but cost you significantly less. And oftentimes I'll use the 80-20 rule as a way that embodies, okay, at what point do I hit
The Pareto principle.
right? Where do I hit the point of diminishing returns where the more money I'm spending, I'm getting less and less and less happiness, and it's no longer worth it?
So, what is the optimal household income
The optimal household income?
for happiness?
Oh, there is none.
Yeah, it varies by state, country by country.
Well, have you ever read the book Your Life or Your Money?
No.
Have you read
No,
that one?
no.
So there's a brilliant example in there. The couple who wrote the original book would do workshops, and they would have people write down what their income was, and they would line people up in order of their income. And the next question down from that was, how much more do you need to make in order to be happy? And no matter what the income level was, it was always somewhere between 50 and 100% more, all the way from the
Yikes.
poverty level to making $300,000, $400,000 a year. Everyone says I need to make 50 to 100% more. And what you do is you stand in the line and you realize, as you're hearing people who are making 50 to 100% more than you, that they're not happy. Making more money is not going to make you happy. It is the exercise of realizing that want begets want. And there was a quote, I can't remember which presidential administration had their economists say this, but it was the insatiable desire for more leads to more desire.
Is that the reason why our government keeps getting bigger?
Well, the more that you get, the more that you want. There is no end to it, and it's part of the reason why the economy can continue to grow at an incredible rate. Is want begets more want. And the concept that I have for frugality, and it would be interesting to discuss how this applies to business. For a personal individual, how do you make it so that want does not beget more want? How do you make it so that you can say, I have enough? I am content with what I
Well,
have.
so with business, I may want a better computer, I may want this, but do I really need it?
Right.
And so you have to go back to, again, frugal, prudent, a good steward. Is that, can I get by another year and try to deal with it? Or is it the return on investment?
Well, the computer example is a good one for me personally. The laptop I have is what, a 2017 laptop?
Yeah.
It's a 2017 MacBook Pro, and it's got a 4-core CPU. The CPU and the GPU cannot tolerate me trying to record a video that I'm reacting to, as well as my own audio and my own video, without dropping to like 8 frames per second.
So it's not keeping up.
It's not keeping up. Now, I'd like to be able to exercise that, but it's sufficient for me reviewing articles or just recording myself as a talking head. And it does manage to do everything I need it to do, even if it's not the best at doing it. So while I want to upgrade machines right now, it's not necessarily a full-blown need. There's that last, I'd say, little bit that I want it to be able to do for recording now, but I have other means of making that work with other existing things. It's just not as convenient at the moment. Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed those highlights. Naturally, we didn't include the whole episode for the main topic. That would have been too long of an episode for us, and it wouldn't have been fair to my brother and my father. With that in mind, I've linked to their full episode down in the show notes in the description for this episode. And if business is a topic of interest to you, I highly recommend that you subscribe to their podcast and give the full episode a listen. Next week on the HopeFilled Financial Podcast, we're going to be covering the top 10 tips to help you stay in budget with your grocery budget. Subscribe if you don't want to miss it. Until then, until next week, until Tuesday, budget bravely and enjoy your HopeFilled financial future.